April 15, 1967, Palm Springs, California. Floyd Odlum's ranch sits in the desert heat. Odlum, the founder of Atlas Corporation, one of the wealthiest men in America, has assembled an unusual audience. Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay is here, the man who firebombed Tokyo, who oversaw Strategic Air Command during the Cuban Missile Crisis, not known for tolerating bullshit. Test pilot Chuck Yeager stands nearby, first person to break the sound barrier, also not known for tolerating bullshit. And there's Thomas Townsend Brown, 62 years old, 45 years into his obsession with a single claim, that electricity can control gravity. Brown demonstrates his device. It's disc-shaped, uses high voltage, and it moves. 2 weeks later, he demonstrates it again, privately this time at Edward Teller's home in Berkeley. Yes, that Ed Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, also not known for tolerating bullshit. 6 months after that, Brown signs a contract with Northrop Corporation. His research transfers to their archives, and his work disappears from public view. Odlum gives him a $1,500 a month pension for life. This is where the story usually goes. Suppression, black projects, classified technology. The man who cracked anti-gravity, silenced by the military-industrial complex. Except, the physics community had already solved this problem in 1952. The effect Brown discovered was real. The explanation was simple, and it had absolutely nothing to do with gravity. So why did serious people keep taking him seriously? This is Theoretical Nonsense. And I'm Jake Vance. Last episode, we talked about computational reality. Information is more fundamental than matter. The holographic principle. The idea that what we call physical reality might be a rendering of deeper information structure. Today, we're looking at a man who thought he'd found a shortcut. A way to hack the rendering engine by coupling electricity to gravity. He hadn't, but for nearly 50 years, people with security clearances and Nobel Prizes kept checking to make sure. Welcome to the story of Thomas Townsend Brown, the man who discovered something real, misunderstood it completely, and somehow convinced generals and physicists to keep investigating long after the science was settled. This is about how you can be right and wrong at the same time. Zanesville, Ohio. Around the year 1921, Thomas Townsend Brown is a teenager with money, son of a wealthy construction family, and an X-ray tube on a balance scale. He's noticed something strange. When he orients the tube differently, the reading changes. The mass appears to shift. He thinks he's discovered something profound, a connection between electricity and gravity. What he's actually discovered we now commonly call ionic wind. Air molecules getting ionized and pushed around by high voltage. But he won't know that for another 30 years, and even then, he won't believe it. This is the pattern that will define Brown's entire life. Observing a real effect, interpreting it incorrectly, and pursuing the wrong explanation with absolute conviction. Or at least that's what the story tells on the surface. Brown takes his discovery to Caltech, invites Nobel laureate Robert Millikan to a demonstration. Millikan says it's impossible, and tells Brown to finish college first. Brown leaves Caltech after 1 year. At Denison, Brown claims extensive collaboration with physics professor Paul Biefeld on what he'll later call the Biefeld-Brown effect. But there's a problem. Denison's archives contain no record of these experiments. Biefeld's son, decades later, says, "My father never did collaborate with Mr. Brown in a scientific sense. They talked often. My father was not too impressed with his ideas." The naming appears to be a credibility-lending fabrication. So far, not a great start. Brown enlists in the Navy in 1930 and gets assigned to the Naval Research Laboratory in 1931, which is unusual for an enlisted sailor. He participates in legitimate work, including the 1932 Navy Princeton Gravity Expedition. But when FOIA requests later seek his service records, the Naval Research Laboratory Archive states they're unable to locate any service records for anyone by the name of Thomas Townsend Brown. October 1942, Brown is discharged to avoid trial by General Court Martial. The official discharge exam makes no comment on reasons. Something went wrong and the details remain classified or lost. So by 1950, Brown's trajectory looks something like wealthy family funds early work, dramatic claims unsupported by credentials, a pattern of relationships ending badly, and missing documentation, classic failed inventor pattern, except people with stars on their shoulders kept showing up to his demonstrations. March 1952. Air Force Major General Victor Bertrandius witnesses Brown's flying disc demo in Hollywood. His report to Lieutenant General H.A. Craig, He's frightened by what he saw, compares it to early atomic development, worries about if it ever gets away into enemy hands. This triggers a formal investigation. The Office of Naval Research assigns physicist Willoughby Cady to evaluate Brown's claims. May through September 1952. Cady observes demonstrations, takes measurements, runs tests. His method for identifying the mechanism: cigarette smoke. He drifts smoke near Brown's apparatus. The smoke moves. There's a wind blowing from the negative electrode to the positive electrode. Cady's conclusion was that all effects are caused by ionization of the air, thrust efficiency around 1.4%. For comparison, a propeller's efficiency is 25%. The math worked. Measured forces matched ionic wind predictions within experimental error. Brown has no explanation for why or how electricity would couple to gravity. Cady's report quotes him, "Mr. Brown has no theory for the effects that he has demonstrated or claimed. Case closed, right? Sure." Here's what Brown actually discovered. When you apply 20 to 50 kilovolts to an asymmetric capacitor, thin wire paired with a larger electrode, the device moves toward the positive electrode. This happens because the high electric field ionizes air molecules near the sharp electrode. The ions accelerate. They collide with neutral air molecules. Momentum transfers. This creates thrust. It's a rocket exhaust made of ionized air instead of combustion products. The technical term, electrohydrodynamic thrust. The casual term, ionic wind. And it's exactly as mundane as it sounds. This isn't anti-gravity. The first problem is conservation of momentum. The device pushes air. Air pushes back. Net force on the air device system is zero. If you want to call that anti-gravity, you also have to call fans anti-gravity and propellers, and breathing heavily in the opposite direction you want to go. The second problem is it stops working in vacuum. 3 separate tests prove this definitively. R.L. Talley, 1988, Air Force study, no thrust at 10 to the -6 torr vacuum. Jonathan Campbell, NASA, 2003, no generated force in proper vacuum. Martin Tajmar, 2004, peer-reviewed AIAA journal paper, enclosed the corona discharge inside a sealed box suspended on wires. If anything besides ionic wind produced thrust, the whole box would move. Result, no linear thrust detected, only internal air circulation. Any anomalous force had to be at least 5 orders of magnitude, or 100,000 times weaker than corona wind. Here's what's interesting. We're still refining our understanding of how this effect actually works. January 2018, Nature Communications, a team from South Korea and Slovenia, publishes new findings on the mechanism. Their discovery, electrons, not just ions, play a major role in generating the thrust. Professor Wonho Cho, Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. In general, the electric wind has been called an ionic wind because only the positive and negative ions have been considered as key players. In our study, however, both electrons and ions participate in the generation of electric wind, depending on the polarity of the biased electrode. They propose calling it electric wind instead of ionic wind because electrons turn out to be the main player during the negative voltage period, rather than negative ions like O2 negative and O negative. Think about what this means. Brown discovered this effect in the 1920s. The 1952 ONR report identified it as ionic wind. The 2004 Tajmar paper confirmed it definitively. And in 2018, nearly a century after Brown's first experiments, we're still publishing in Nature about the underlying mechanism. We understand what the effect is. We're still refining how it works at the particle level. This is important for 2 reasons. 1, it shows this is legitimate physics, real, ongoing research, not fringe pseudoscience. 2, it means when people say, the official explanation is incomplete, they're not entirely wrong. The explanation is correct, but the details keep getting refined, which creates space for doubt. For, what if they're missing something? They're not missing anything about gravity, but they are still learning about the electrodynamics. Tajmar titled his paper, Biefeld-Brown Effect, Misinterpretation of Corona Wind Phenomena. He concluded, the author hopes that the paper will help to put an end to a story that lasted some 80 years. NASA's 2009 technical memorandum. The thrust observed did equal the thrust of the ionic wind. When ionic wind was blocked, thrust disappeared. The debunking is comprehensive. The scientific consensus has been complete since 2004. Searching Biefeld-Brown electrogravity on Google Scholar yields 8 results. As one physicist noted, the fewest I've ever seen for a search like this. The term electrogravitics has been abandoned by mainstream science as unscientific. So, Brown discovered something real. It just wasn't what he thought it was. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because serious people kept investigating anyway. Despite the 1952 ONR debunking, aerospace companies continued researching electrogravitics for years. A 1956 Aviation Studies Limited report, originally classified, later declassified, listed major corporations investigating: Glenn Martin, Convair, Lear, Sperry Rand, Bell, Douglas, Lockheed, General Electric. And the headline from the New York Herald Tribune, November 1955, Conquest of Gravity Aim of Top Scientists in U.S. Why? Why would corporations invest in technology already debunked by Navy physicists? Couple possibilities. 1, corporate inertia, Cold War paranoia, the fear of missing something revolutionary. 2, they hadn't seen Cady's full report, classification compartmentalized information, different contractors didn't know what others had learned. 3, and this is the interesting one, maybe there was more to the story than the declassified Cady report revealed. We'll come back to that last one. Agnew Bonson, wealthy North Carolina HVAC heir, aviation enthusiast, private pilot, sci-fi author, and absolutely obsessed with anti-gravity. November 1957, Bonson funds Brown's most ambitious laboratory yet, Winston-Salem, private facility, serious equipment. January 11, 1958, Brown achieves what his notes call 100% counterbury, claimed full gravity neutralization, captured on 16mm film. The footage exists in family archives. What it actually shows, levitation in air using ionic wind or something genuinely anomalous in vacuum, remains disputed, but here's what makes this credible. Bonson didn't just fund crackpots. He also funded the Institute for Field Physics at University of North Carolina. This organization hosted the Chapel Hill Conference in 1957, the first major gravity research conference since Einstein published general relativity in 1915. That conference brought together people like John Wheeler, Richard Feynman, Bryce DeWitt, real physicists doing real work, and several of them went to evaluate Brown's devices. Bryce DeWitt, the guy who later formulated the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, popularized many worlds interpretation, visited Bonson's lab in December 1957. Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, evaluated Brown's 1967 demonstration. Louis Witten, Ed Witten's father, no slouch physicist himself, inspected the Winston-Salem setup. Witten's assessment: I went to visit him and visited his laboratory. The basic idea was he had a strong electrostatic field, about 150,000 volts over the distance of about a meter. But I knew enough about experiments to know that this was not a very happy place. For strong electrostatic fields, there shouldn't be any sharp points around. Everything should be curved, and nothing was curved. Translation: Brown's experimental setup was precisely configured to maximize ionic wind while he was claiming to measure anti-gravity. A competent physicist spotted the problem on visual inspection. The consensus from these heavyweight physicists: likely due to electrostatic effects, which is exactly what ionic wind is. So serious scientists evaluated the work, in real time, and identified conventional explanations, no conspiracy required. And then, September 29, 1958, Brown's notebooks abruptly stop. The Bonson laboratory ends suddenly in August 1958. The missing years from 1958 to 1963 contain minimal documentation. Family sources claim Brown was recruited for classified work. By whom? For what purpose? Unspecified. Alternatively, personal crisis, health problems, funding disputes, mundane explanations that leave no documentary trail. Then, June 1964, Bonson dies in a plane crash, officially flew into electric wires. He was an experienced pilot. Bonson's heirs dissolved the laboratory. Conspiracy theorists find this timing suspicious, but the simpler explanation, wealthy patron dies, private funding evaporates, requires no conspiracy. The universe doesn't need to arrange elaborate accidents. Sometimes gravity just wins. Which brings us back to April 1967. Brown resurges, this time with a new backer, Floyd Odlum, founder of Atlas Corporation. April 15th, demonstration for Curtis LeMay and Chuck Yeager at Odlum's Palm Springs Ranch. 2 weeks later, private demonstration at Edward Teller's Berkeley home. August, Brown signs contract with Guidance Technology, Inc. September, his documents transferred to Northrop Corporation. November, Aviation Week reports Northrop studying new means of reducing aerodynamic drag by ionizing air at wing leading edge. Then the project terminates. Odlum provides Brown a $1,500 a month lifetime pension through 1985. This is the moment conspiracy theories crystallize around. Two interpretations. 1. Odlum bought Brown's silence after moving the work to classified channels. Northrop developed the technology in secret. The B-2 stealth bomber uses it. 2. Wealthy patron paid off failed inventor out of kindness. March 1992, Aviation Week article. The B-2 charges its leading edge to many millions of volts with exhaust stream oppositely charged. This is real, documented, patents exist. But the application is likely boundary layer control and stealth. Ionized air absorbs radar, not primary propulsion. The B-2 uses 4 General Electric F-118 turbofan engines for all thrust. Conventional jet propulsion, no anti-gravity required. Still, the timing is suggestive. Northrop receives Brown's work in 1967. 20 years later, they build a flying wing that electrically charges its surfaces. Coincidence? Derivative research? Something classified? We don't know, and that's the honest answer. 1996. NASA Glenn Research Center launches the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics Program. Mission: investigate speculative concepts for space propulsion, warp drives, quantum vacuum fluctuations, anything that might bypass rocket equation limitations. Budget, $1.2 million total over 6 years. Director, Mark Millis. This is where electrogravitics should have had its renaissance. If there was anything to Brown's claims, NASA's dedicated program to find breakthrough propulsion would have found it. Millis evaluated electrogravitics explicitly. His assessment? These Biefeld-Brown lifter and asymmetrical capacitor thrusters are not viable candidates for breakthrough physics propulsion. All rigorous experimental tests indicate that the observed thrust is attributable to ion wind. The program ran until 2002, tested dozens of speculative ideas. Electrogravitics was excluded from further investigation after initial evaluation, not because of suppression, because the physics was already settled. But here's what's interesting about the BPP program. It existed at all. NASA spent $1.2 million investigating things that sound like science fiction. Warp drives, wormholes, vacuum energy, which means at some level the institution was willing to seriously evaluate revolutionary propulsion concepts. They looked at electrogravitics, they tested it, they set it aside. If there was anything there, presumably this was the moment it would have been found. Unless, of course, the real research was happening somewhere else, which brings us to the UAP question. Here's what the documents tell us. Brown filed numerous patents from 1928 through the 1960s. The first, British patent GB 300311 1928, described gravitator devices claiming electrical methods to control gravity. But tellingly, Brown's later 1960s patents shifted terminology from electrogravitic to electrokinetic. U.S. Patent 2,949,550, filed 1957, granted 1960, explicitly describes force from ion momentum transfer. When electrodes are held in fixed, spaced relation and immersed in a dielectric medium and oppositely charged, a force is produced tending to move the pair of electrodes through the medium. This is ionic wind described in patent language. All Brown's patents remain public, unclassified, unusual for truly revolutionary military technology. The one commercial application that emerged, the Ionic Breeze air purifier by Sharper Image, released in 1987. The product explicitly cited Brown's patents, proving the effect works perfectly as an air-moving device, not anti-gravity. November 14, 2004, USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, Pacific Ocean. Commander David Fravor intercepts a white, tic-tac-shaped object with no wings, no exhaust, just hovering above a churning disturbance in the ocean. It mirrors his movements, then disappears, reappears 60 miles away in less than a minute. No sonic boom, multiple sensors, and Spy-1 radar, E-2 Hawkeye, FA-18 at FLIR infrared, and of course, visual observations from 4 highly trained observers. Here's why electrogravitics keeps getting connected to UAPs. The described behavior, instant acceleration, no visible propulsion, silent operation, transmedium capability, looks exactly like what you'd expect if something was manipulating gravity fields or creating thrust without expelling mass. Visually, phenomenologically, it maps to the electrogravitic stream. Brown's disks move silently through air with no visible propulsion. The tic-tac moves silently through air with no visible propulsion. Brown claimed transmedium capability. The tic-tac allegedly demonstrated air-water transitions. Brown's devices operated at high voltage. Whistleblower claims consistently mention gravity amplifiers using electromagnetic fields. The problem is, we know electrohydrodynamic thrust can't do what the tic-tac allegedly did. Ionic wind stops working at high altitude, requires atmosphere. Efficiency drops dramatically with velocity. Can't achieve supersonic speeds without sonic booms because you're still pushing air around, just with ions instead of propellers. So either the tic-tac reports are mistaken or it's using something else entirely. but the visual similarity persists in people's minds. Bob Lazar claimed in 1989 to have reverse-engineered craft at S4 near Area 51. His description: gravity amplifiers using element 115 to generate gravity waves that the craft rides like a boat on water. Element 115, moscovium, was synthesized in 2003, added to the periodic table in 2013. All known isotopes decay in milliseconds. No stable isotope exists or is predicted. No exotic gravity effects observed in any super-heavy element research. Lazar's educational credentials can't be verified. MIT and Caltech have no records. But here's what's interesting. Lazar's description of the propulsion system, electromagnetic field manipulation creating gravitational effects, echoes exactly what Brown was claiming decades earlier. And it keeps appearing in whistleblower testimony. David Grush, 2023 congressional hearing discussing alleged reverse engineering programs. Multiple Navy pilots describing craft with no visible means of propulsion. The 2024 AARO report analyzing 1,652 UAP cases. Of those 1,652 cases, resolved incidents overwhelmingly identified balloons, birds, drones, satellites, especially Starlink, and conventional aircraft. Only 21 cases remain truly anomalous. Anomalous meaning insufficient data, not alien, not physics-defying. Notably, 50% of reports cluster near U.S. military training areas. This indicates collection bias, more sensors watching those areas, not alien interest in military bases. Skeptical explanations for Nimitz. Radar spoofing tests, electronic warfare exercises on unsuspecting personnel, sensor artifacts combined with expectation bias, or submarine operations creating the water disturbance. None perfectly explains all observations, but gaps in data aren't proof of exotic propulsion. Here's the pattern. Brown discovers electrohydrodynamic thrust in the 1920s and misinterprets it as anti-gravity. Demonstrates it to military officials in the 1950s to 60s. They investigate, find conventional explanations, but maintain interest long enough to create a paper trail. That paper trail, classified proposals, corporate research, demonstrations to generals, gets declassified decades later. UFO researchers find it, connect dots. Military interest in gravity control plus classified programs plus Brown's claims equals secret anti-gravity technology. Add incredible UAP reports with unexplained characteristics. Add whistleblower testimony mentioning similar concepts. The pattern reinforces itself. But here's the thing about patterns. They can emerge from noise, or they can point to signal. The physics debunking is solid. Electrohydrodynamic thrust is not anti-gravity. Brown was wrong about the mechanism, but the institutional behavior, decades of continued interest, missing files, classified acquisitions, lifetime pensions, suggests something happened that we're not seeing in declassified documents. Maybe it was just Cold War paranoia, fear of missing something revolutionary. Maybe it was boundary layer control research for stealth applications. Or maybe, and this is some mild speculation, maybe someone found something else entirely while investigating Brown's claims, and electrogravitics became the cover story. Eric Weinstein has talked about how string theory consumed theoretical physics for decades. Brilliant minds chasing mathematical beauty without experimental confirmation. He's alluded, carefully, never explicitly, to the possibility that this wasn't accidental, that concentrating physics talent on unfalsifiable theories might serve other interests. What if electrogravitics served a similar function? Or what if it needed to be distracted from? Not that it works, but that investigating it led somewhere else. And publicizing the debunking, making sure everyone knew it was just ionic wind, ensured nobody kept looking. I don't necessarily buy into this, but it's not impossible. And I think it's more interesting than Brown was right all along. Because if you wanted to hide breakthrough propulsion research, you wouldn't classify everything. You'd declassify the failures, publish the debunking, make sure everyone knew electrogravitics was a dead end, and then you'd keep working on whatever you actually found. The theoretical physics is unambiguous. For gravity manipulation at kilovolt energies, you'd need new fundamental forces, exotic matter, Planck scale access at achievable energies. That's extraordinarily unlikely. But extraordinarily unlikely isn't impossible. And 70 years of classified aerospace research, missing FBI files, and institutional behavior that doesn't quite match the official story leaves room for questions. Not about Brown's physics, that's settled, but about what else might have been found while investigating it. Why did aerospace companies continue research for 4 to 7 years after the 1952 ONR debunking? Why did Northrop buy Brown out with a lifetime pension if his technology was worthless? What happened during the missing years from 1958 to 1963? The FBI maintained files on Brown. Those files were destroyed on multiple dates in 1971 and 1990. A February 2018 FOIA response. Records were not in their expected location and could not be located after a reasonable search. The French Essencasso tests in 1955 to 56, Project Montgolfier, claimed successful vacuum operation. This contradicts later rigorous vacuum studies. Either Brown's 1950s vacuum wasn't actually a good vacuum, measurement errors occurred, or results were misinterpreted. We don't have the actual experimental data, just summaries. And the 16mm film from Bonson's laboratory showing 100% counterbury. That footage exists in family archives. We saw purported versions of the footage today. Has it been independently analyzed? Not that I can find. What does it actually show to my untrained eye, outside the lab coats and champagne? Not a lot. So, what's the verdict? Thomas Townsend Brown discovered electrohydrodynamic thrust before the phenomenon was well understood. Devices based on his patents now purify air and cool electronics. MIT's ion-powered aircraft validates the principle he demonstrated. That's his genuine contribution. But the extraordinary claims, coupling electricity to gravity, space propulsion, revolutionary physics, are definitively debunked. Multiple independent peer-reviewed studies, no anomalous forces in proper vacuum, no mechanism for EM gravity coupling at kilovolt energies, perfect agreement between ionic wind predictions and measured thrust. The effect disappears without atmosphere, works exactly as conventional physics predicts, requires no new theoretical framework. Here's what we know for certain. Brown observed a real effect, misinterpreted it his entire life, attracted genuine military interest in the 1950s before the physics was understood, demonstrated real but misunderstood effects to high-level figures, watched institutional interest evaporate once rigorous testing revealed limitations. What happened to his research after 1967 remains unclear. Maybe it disappeared into classified boundary layer control research for stealth applications. The Northrop to B2 connection. Maybe it just died as another failed propulsion concept. Either way, he didn't crack anti-gravity. He made really sophisticated fans. But here's what interests me. Last episode, we talked about computational reality. Information is fundamental. The holographic principle. Reality as a rendering of deeper structure. Brown thought he'd found a hack. A way to manipulate the rendering engine by coupling forces that seemed separate. He was wrong about the mechanism, but the impulse was correct. Gravity and electromagnetism are connected, just not the way he thought. General relativity shows electromagnetic energy contributes to space-time curvature via the stress-energy tensor. String theory unifies all forces. The holographic principle suggests information at boundaries determines bulk physics. Brown was looking for connections between fundamental forces at a time when physicists were splitting them apart. He was asking a right question with wrong tools. And maybe that's the lesson. The universe doesn't care about our misunderstandings. It keeps operating according to its rules, whether we interpret them correctly or not. Brown moved air around with high voltage for 50 years, convinced he was bending space-time. The air didn't know the difference. The thrust was real. The interpretation was wrong. And somewhere in that gap between observation and explanation, between what happens and what we think happens, is where all of science lives. But here's what keeps me up at night. What if Brown was right that something interesting happens when you manipulate electromagnetic fields at extreme voltages, just wrong about what it was? What if someone somewhere, in a classified facility with better equipment and theoretical framework, found the thing Brown was actually seeing through the noise of ionic wind? What if the debunking is real, but incomplete? I don't have evidence for this, I don't have data for this, but the institutional behavior, the missing files, the destroyed FBI records, the Northrop buyout, the 70 years of on and off military interest, despite consistent debunking, doesn't quite fit the narrative of simple failure. Maybe it's just bureaucratic weirdness, Cold War paranoia, creating patterns and noise. Or maybe there's more to this story than what's in the scientific papers. Paul Shatskin, Brown's biographer, and Jesse Michaels, who made an excellent documentary on Brown, uncovered connections that raise questions, not answers, questions. So let's talk about the parts of this story that don't quite add up. Throughout his life, Thomas Townsend Brown was obsessed with time travel, not as a side interest, as a constant theme in conversations with his wife Josephine, his daughter Linda, and his colleagues. Shatskin documents Brown spending extensive time in Nassau in the Bahamas during the 1950s and 60s. He was close with William Stephenson, Winston Churchill's super spy, the inspiration for Ian Fleming's James Bond character. Stevenson was coordinating with Wild Bill Donovan during the formation of the CIA, working out of Rockefeller Center as part of what some called a shadow government. And Brown was there, talking about time travel, constantly. Here's where it gets weird. Chris Bledsoe, who's appeared on several podcasts discussing his unusual experiences, claims that Tim Taylor, a NASA mission controller, told him he was part of a secret time travel group in Nassau, and the president of that group, Thomas Townsend Brown. I have no way to verify this, and it sounds insane, but Linda Brown, Townsend's daughter, wrote a review of Tim Taylor's biography Launch Fever years before Diana Pasulka pseudonymously published about Taylor in American Cosmic. There's a connection there. We just don't know what it means. In 1957, physicists held the Chapel Hill Conference on the role of gravitation in physics. Agnew Bonson, the air conditioning magnate who funded Brown's work, was operating what we now know was essentially a CIA satellite research program at UNC Chapel Hill. His Institute of Field Physics was studying anti-gravity with government money. At this conference, Austrian mathematician Herman Bondi presented work on negative mass and general relativity. Eric Weinstein, discussing this conference with Joe Rogan, explained it like this. Normally, masses attract each other gravitationally, but with negative mass, something strange happens. The negative mass is still attracted to the positive mass, but the positive mass is repelled by the negative mass. Result, the negative mass chases the positive mass. They accelerate together indefinitely. Sound familiar? Brown's devices, negative electrode chasing positive electrode, exactly the behavior Bondi described. And Brown was at the Chapel Hill Conference. According to researcher Paul Laviolette, Brown showed up while theoretical physicists were groping in the dark at solutions for anti-gravity, while he was building working devices in the back lab. Weinstein said something else interesting. The highbrow version doesn't work, and the lowbrow version doesn't work, so far as we know. The lowbrow version is called electrogravitics. But how do we know electrogravitics doesn't work? What if the term electrogravitics was invented specifically to stigmatize Brown's actual experimental results, to make it sound fringe, unserious, beneath academic investigation? Michaels spoke to a SpaceX veteran who said Boeing and Lockheed Martin used to call everything rocket science to make it sound more esoteric than it was. To discourage new entrants like SpaceX, was the same thing happening with electrogravitics? One of the strangest aspects of Brown's work, sidereal radiation. Brown noticed that the position of the sun and moon affected his gravitator's performance. Not a lot, but measurably. He spent decades building electrometers, sensitive detectors, looking for patterns, and he found them. Correlations with the sidereal calendar, the calendar by the stars, not the sun. At first, this sounds like complete quackery. Then Michaels had a call with a prominent Harvard physicist, someone who chose to remain anonymous because of Brown's stigma, who is a secret fan of Brown's work and very interested in sidereal radiation. British experimentalist Rupert Sheldrake documented something similar. Big G, the gravitational constant, varies by more than 1.3% across different measurements. It changes from place to place, time to time. The scientific establishment says measurement error. Sheldrake asks, what if it's actually changing? What if gravitational force isn't constant? What if Brown wasn't crazy when he tracked these patterns? There's a theoretical framework that could explain Brown's observations. It's called extended electrodynamics. James Clerk Maxwell originally wrote 20 equations for electromagnetism in 1865. Each equation described one component of the electric and magnetic fields. Oliver Heaviside condensed these down to 4 equations. Simpler, more elegant, but the simplification removed possibilities. The original Maxwell equations allowed for 3 types of electromagnetic waves. Heaviside's version only allows for one, the conventional transverse wave. Physicist Hendrik Lorentz imposed another constraint. He set a relationship between scalar and vector potentials equal to 0. This constraint is arbitrary. It simplified the math, but it limited what the equations could describe in nature. Extended electrodynamics removes that constraint, uses Maxwell's original framework, and suddenly, anomalous effects, like the Byfield-Brown effect, become theoretically possible. Michaels interviewed a Navy scientist who studies this. The scientist chose to remain anonymous for fear of reprisals from his superiors. Here's what he said. With extended electrodynamics, you now have the possibility of at least 3 completely new kinds of waves. In 1988, SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, studied electrokinetics and anti-gravity for Edwards Air Force Base. Their conclusion? Dr. James Woodward's work on anti-gravity, built on Townsend Brown's research on capacitors, demonstrated theoretical validity and warranted further funding. The report stated that a five-dimensional framework could lead to unified field theory and novel propulsion methods. So, if it's just ionic wind, if there's no there, why did the Air Force keep funding theoretical frameworks? Why did SAIC recommend continued support in 1988, 36 years after the 1952 Cady report supposedly closed the case? In 1945, Brown went to Germany. Officially, Martin Corporation sent him to retrieve exotic propulsion technology from Nazi research facilities. There are rumors, unverified but persistent, of a Nazi device called Die Glock. The bell-shaped, high voltage, magnetic field separation, and vortex compression, supposedly designed for anti-gravity and time manipulation. SS officer Jakob Sporenberg documented it. Walter Gerlach, a well-respected physicist interested in anti-gravity, apparently worked on it. Polish journalist Igor Witkowski claims extensive documentation exists. Does Die Glock connect to Brown's work? I don't know, but we know Brown retrieved something from Germany in 1945. We know he went to work for Bonson's CIA-funded anti-gravity program. We know he demonstrated devices to Curtis LeMay, Edward Teller, and Chuck Yeager 22 years later. And we know he spent the rest of his life convinced that gravity manipulation and time travel were connected, because in general relativity they are. Time slows near gravitational sources. You create a gravitational source through mass, or through energy. With high enough energy, the kind Brown was using, maybe you could create localized time dilation effects. I'm not saying this happened. I'm saying Brown thought it could happen. And he had Edward Teller standing in his lab saying, "I have no idea what makes this work." Robert Sarbacher was Einstein's student, a Harvard physicist, highly credible. He was also close with Townsend Brown. Toward the end of his life, Sarbacher told UFO researcher William Steinman that the rumors surrounding UFO crashes are substantially correct. David Grush, the recent UFO whistleblower, publicly stated that Sarbacher helped set up UFO secrecy. So here's the question Michaels poses, and I think it's worth asking. Were the UFO crashes in the 1940s and 50s actual extraterrestrial craft? Or were they early gravity-controlled technology that we figured out, based partly on Brown's work, partly on retrieved Nazi research, that crashed because it didn't work very well yet? Brown's 1953 Winter Haven proposal describes a compartmentalized research structure where nobody has the whole picture, they just have pieces. Whistleblowers describe America's secret UFO programs exactly the same way. And then there's this. Brown talked constantly and earnestly with his family about UFOs and time travel, not as disinformation, just belief. Were the UFOs time travel, gravity control, extraterrestrials, or are those distinctions meaningless once you start manipulating space-time? So what actually happened? Thomas Townsend Brown discovered electrohydrodynamic thrust. That's real, that's proven. MIT's Ion aircraft validates it. The extraordinary claims, gravity coupling, space propulsion, are debunked by rigorous vacuum studies, but the FBI maintained files on Brown. Those files were destroyed on multiple dates in 1971 and 1990. A 2018 FOIA request. Records were not in their expected location. The Naval Research Laboratory says they can't find Brown's service records, despite documented letters proving he worked there. The Northrop buyout in 1967, lifetime pension of $1,500 a month, for technology that supposedly doesn't work. The Air Force continuing to derive theoretical frameworks decades after supposedly debunking the effect. SAIC recommending continued funding in 1988. Prominent physicists and NASA scientists remaining anonymous to discuss Brown's work because of stigma. Either this is the most elaborately bureaucratic failure in aerospace history, or something about Brown's work, not the gravity coupling, but something he discovered while investigating it, was worth keeping quiet. Paul Shatskin and Jesse Michaels have compiled this picture from family interviews, declassified documents, and off-the-record conversations with physicists who won't go on the record. I can't verify the time travel stories, the secret groups in Nassau, the claim that Brown was president of anything, but I can verify the pattern of institutional interest, the destroyed records, the theoretical work continuing decades after case closed, and I can verify that Brown himself, according to his daughter, his biographer, and contemporaries, genuinely believed he'd found something profound, something that connected gravity, electromagnetism, and time. He died in 1985, largely forgotten. His patents are public, his equations are published, his effects are replicated, and somehow, after 70 years, we're still not sure what he actually discovered. Maybe ionic wind. Maybe something else hidden in the noise. Or maybe the real discovery wasn't in his lab. Maybe it was in the labs of people who came after him. People with better equipment, better theory, and security clearances that prevent them from publishing. We're all just making really sophisticated fans. The question is whether some of us are making other things too in rooms we can't see. And whether Thomas Townsend Brown, may be wrong about gravity, right about the questions, lit the path that led there. Brown died in 1985, largely forgotten. His patents are public, his equations are published, and nobody's building gravitators, either because they don't work or because someone already did. Next time, the other inventors they erased. The pattern of suppression that either happened or didn't, depending on which documentary evidence you trust. I'm Jake Vance. This is Theoretical Nonsense. Thanks for watching, and thanks for being curious.